The wind screamed like a chorus of forgotten voices, whipping through the crooked rows of headstones as Thomas shielded the flickering lantern flame with one calloused hand. His coat, worn and patched at the elbows, flapped violently around his knees. He paused, squinting into the shifting fog. There it was, again, a flicker of movement, low to the ground, darting between the moss-covered graves. His breath caught, not from fear but recognition. This wasn't the first night. Someone kept returning. He knelt, holding the lantern lower, trying to pierce the mist, crawling along the earth like ghostly fingers. "What are you?" he whispered to the cold night, the light trembling in his grip as the shadows slipped out of sight again. 5 nights. Always the same hour, just past midnight. Always the same path, the narrow corridor between the older graves, where ivy strangled the names from marble. Thomas had grown used to the dead silence, but this nightly visitor was different. Not a spirit, not a person. He couldn't say why he was so sure, but he was. The form was low, graceful, silent as a breeze, and each time it came, it disappeared into the thickest part of the fog, as if it belonged to it. He'd followed once only to find nothing but his own breath rising like smoke. His cabin stood just beyond the Rotteron fence, barely more than a shadow in the trees, built from timber and time. Inside, everything remained untouched. The old rocking chair with the blue knit throw still draped over its back, her china teacup on the sill, rim cracked but never discarded. The scent of dried lavender lingered in corners like her ghost. Thomas had kept it all exactly as it was, because moving on felt like betrayal, because forgetting hurt more than remembering. The house, like the cemetery, held memory in every creak and crack. And though the world forgot her, he had not for a second. Solitude wasn't a curse. For Thomas, it was a form of clarity. He'd loved once deeply, trusted others, extended open hands only to have them slapped away or left hanging. Over time, silence became safer than conversation, routine more faithful than company. People promised and then vanished, but the wind, the trees, the moonlight on marble, they never pretended to be anything they weren't. And that's why he stayed. That's why he walked among the dead. The living had taught him how much it hurt to be left behind. Among the gravestones, there was no judgment, no small talk, no masks, just names, dates, and stories too deep for words. Thomas often walked the rows at night, whispering hellos to names no one visited anymore. He'd grown to know the cemetery like an old friend, its cracks, its sighs, its quiet sorrow. It was the one place where his grief didn't feel out of place, where tears were not a weakness, but a language the ground already understood. Something had shifted. The quiet that once embraced him now felt sharp-edged, watching. Each night, after the shadow passed, a restless energy lingered in the eras. If the cemetery was holding its breath, the fog curled tighter, the cold bit harder. The silence wasn't peace anymore, it was waiting. Thomas couldn't explain it, but the cemetery wasn't just a place of rest now. It felt like someone was calling. It wasn't random, the way it moved, the path it followed, the pause it took near a particular grave, her grave. Thomas had watched from behind cracked shutters, eyes narrowing, heart pounding. The creature, he was sure it was a dog now. A German shepherd wasn't just passing through. It knew where it was going. And deep in his bones, Thomas felt it. This animal was looking for something, or someone. And whatever it was, it had something to do with him. The fog lay thick across the hillside, swallowing gravestones like waves of a silent sea. Thomas gripped his flashlight, breath clouding the air, heart pounding not just from the cold, but from something else, a presence. Moments earlier, he'd seen it. A shadow, human-like in stature, but too quick, too smooth in motion. Now it is gone, still. Something, curiosity, dread, maybe a longing he couldn't explain, pulled him deeper into the graveyard. The old iron gate creaked behind him, and every crunch of frost beneath his boots felt like a trespass. Somewhere ahead, under the glow of a distant moonbeam, a shape stirred again, and Thomas moved toward it. The sound, raw, guttural, protective, froze Thomas mid-step. His flashlight caught it. This time, not a ghost, a dog, a German shepherd, gaunt and shaking, yet standing tall in the biting wind. Its ribs showed through a matted coat, patches of fur missing, but its eyes burned with a strange fire. Thomas raised both hands in slow caution, whispering something soft, though even he didn't know what. The growl softened, but never disappeared. The dog wasn't attacking. It wasn't guarding itself. It was guarding something behind it. Thomas's eyes shifted past the animal. A lone gravestone peeked through the fog, the earth surrounding it. Covered in frost, the shepherd didn't move. Its body was still, but its soul seemed locked in vigil. The dog's eyes didn't follow Thomas, they were fixed, eternally, on the grave before it. The headstone was worn, grey, almost forgotten by time. The wind howled, lifting bits of brittle grass and old petals around the stone. But the dog didn't blink, didn't flinch, as if time itself had abandoned this sacred post, and only it remained, to remember what others had left behind. Thomas felt it, then not fear, but reverence, like stepping into a memory. "Hey girl, it's okay," he murmured, kneeling slightly and extending his gloved hand. No reaction. The dog's breath came in steady puffs, white against the night. Her ears didn't twitch. Her gaze didn't shift. She didn't retreat or advance. She simply was, a guardian, a sorrow statue, and Thomas, without knowing why, didn't feel the urge to touch her anymore. He lowered his hand, his voice catching with emotion he hadn't expected. There was pain here, and she carried it with grace. Thomas stepped closer, careful not to startle her. He brushed snow from the headstone and read the inscription aloud. Emily Carter, 2005 to 2019. His throat tightened. 14. The date lingered in the air like a whisper, hanging between them. He looked back at the dog, whose gaze never wavered from the name carved in stone. Thomas didn't know who Emily was, but he was sure the shepherd did. A bundle of long-dead flowers clung to the base of the stone, their petals crumbling at the touch of wind. The soil was hard and cracked, untouched by recent footsteps. No toys, no fresh tributes, just time and silence. Except for her, the shepherd stood against the cold, her presence louder than any eulogy. The next morning, Thomas walked into the town diner, ordering coffee more for conversation than warmth. "Emily Carter," he asked the older waitress. She paused, brow furrowing. "Oh, quiet girl," kept to herself. Another patron chimed in, eyes distant. Her dog, that shepherd. She followed Emily everywhere. School, park, even to church. Another voice, a whisper. "They say the dog was there the night she passed." No one finished the sentence, just silence. "And then, she still goes to the grave, doesn't she?" Thomas nodded. "Every night." And so it continued. Night after night, Thomas watched from afar. The shepherd arrived as dusk fell, slipping through the same broken fence panel. She made no sound, just walked to the grave, sat and waited. The wind came and went. The frost thickened, but the dog remained, until the very first breath of morning light peeked over the hill. And then she was gone, swallowed by trees or fog or something more unknowable. It was as if she returned to another world after her vigil, leaving her heart behind with the girl she'd never stopped loving. He began with bits of leftover chicken, then warm stew in a bowl. At first, she wouldn't eat until he was gone, but slowly the routine became theirs. She'd arrive, eat quietly, then return to the grave. Each time, Thomas sat farther back, not wanting to disrupt the ritual, but desperate to understand it. Their connection was growing, not through touch or words, but through silence and patience. He named her Winnie, short for Winona, meaning faithful companion. She never barked, never begged, just watched and waited. Snow blanketed the earth like sorrow. Even the trees stood bare, grieving with silent limbs. Thomas found himself returning earlier, staying longer. He wanted to know not just who Emily had been, but why. This dog defied storms, time, and hunger to return. What promise had been made? What bond ran so deep it survived even death? Each night, Thomas watched Winnie and felt the gravity of love that refused to let go. And deep inside, something began to thaw. The evenings had begun to feel different. Thomas first noticed it 3 nights ago, the outline of the dog, half blurred by distance and dusk, sitting just at the edge of the tree line behind his cabin, not moving, not barking, just watching Dot by. The second night, the dog had crept forward, stopping a few feet closer. The snow crunched beneath his weight, but he made no sound otherwise. Thomas, pretending not to look, watched through the corner of his eye as he tossed scraps of stew into the clearing. Last night, the dog was almost on the porch, close enough for Thomas to see the faint scar across his muzzle and the tremble in his legs. He was all bones and shadow, still not ready to cross the threshold, but no longer hiding. Thomas hadn't meant to name him, but in his head he already had Dot. Shadow, if Fitz Island, wounded, always lingering near, like the sorrow Thomas had lived with since his wife passed. And every night, Shadow returned. It was colder than usual that evening, the kind of cold that gnaws into your bones. Thomas sat on the porch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and set a bowl of warm broth just a few feet from his boots. He didn't look up. He didn't call. He simply waited. The wind rustled. Pine branches creaked, and for a while it seemed like Shadow wouldn't come. But then a crunch of paws in snow, a hesitation, a breath. Thomas didn't dare move. Then warmth, damp and trembling. A black nose touched his fingertips, followed by the light press of a muzzle into his palm. Thomas's breath hitched. Slowly, he opened his hand, revealing a sliver of meat. Shadow's tongue flicked it away, his amber eyes never breaking contact. It lasted only seconds, but something unspoken passed between them. Fragile, trembling, real. Shadow retreated into the trees. But that night, Thomas left the cabin door slightly ajar, just in case. The fire crackled softly. Thomas sat inside, staring. At the open doorway, he hadn't thought about Lily in days, not really. But tonight, her voice came back clear, bright, filled with laughter. One day we'll get a dog, a big one, loyal, a protector. You'll see, Thomas, he'll change everything. Back then, he'd chuckled and brushed it off. I'm not a dog person, he'd said, but she'd known better. His hand unconsciously reached for the place beside him on the couch, the place where she used to rest her head. Empty now, still. Tears welled unexpectedly, not from grief alone, but from something new, something stirring beneath the ash of sorrow. Hope. Outside, a shadow moved quietly past the window. Thomas didn't flinch. He simply whispered, "He's here, Lily. You were right." The snow muffled all sound as Thomas stepped outside the next morning. Shadow didn't run. He was sitting beneath the old cedar, tail curled tight, breath fogging in the cold air. Thomas crouched slowly, inching closer, heart pounding. He extended his hand not with food, but with trust. This time, Shadow didn't flinch. Thomas's fingers grazed his fur course, cold but real. Shadow leaned in, just slightly, pressing his shoulder against Thomas's knee. In that silent moment, surrounded by pine and frost and morning light, two kinds of grief met and rested together. Man and dog, past and present, wounds and warmth. Bell above the store door chimed as Thomas entered, brushing snow from his coat. "Morning, Tom," said Harold, the grocer, handing over a cup of steaming coffee. "Saw that mutt near your place again." Thomas nodded. "That dog's bad news," Harold continued, lowering his voice. "Folks say he belonged to old Miller, the one who lost his farm. Dog went wild after that. Hurt another hound, maybe worse." Thomas said nothing. He thought of the trembling in Shadow's body, the way his eyes never asked for anything, just a quiet place to exist. People feared what they didn't understand. He took his coffee, nodded politely, and left without a word. Let them talk that evening. Thomas didn't bring food. He brought a chair. He sat a few feet from where Shadow always waited, not speaking, not moving, just watching. The dog met his gaze. There was something there, not aggression, not wildness, just hurts, deep and quiet. Thomas recognized it. The emptiness, the waiting. They want to trust, but not know how. It mirrored the ache he'd carried since Lily's last breath. Two broken souls, one truth shared silently between them. Thomas whispered, "You're not the only one who got left behind." The storm rolled in fast angry clouds, wind like a scream. Thomas stood on the porch, squinting through rain and flashing sky. Shadow wasn't there. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the clearing was empty. Thomas waited, called, whistled. Lo, nothing. A flash of lightning revealed only snow-churned ground, paw prints smeared and washed away. Panic rose fast and sharp in his chest. He grabbed his coat, pulled on his boots, and lit the lantern. The forest was a blur of movement and shadows, but he didn't hesitate. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Thunder cracked again and Thomas ran. The woods had turned wild, trees groaned in the wind, and broken branches littered the path like bones. Thomas stumbled more than once, soaked and shivering, but didn't stop. He called Shadow's name again and again, hoping against the thunder. Then a sound faint, a low whimper, barely audible over the rain. He followed it. There, beneath a fallen limb, lay Shadow trapped, his hind leg pinned under a thick branch, eyes wide with fear but no fight left in them. "Easy, boy," Thomas murmured, kneeling beside him. "I've got you." With a grunt, he heaved the branch aside. Shadow didn't move, but when Thomas touched him, the dog let out a shuddered breath and closed his eyes, not out of pain. Out of trust. Shadow was heavier than he looked, soaked, muddy, and limp with exhaustion. He rested his head against Thomas's chest as the man carried him through the rain. Each step was harder than the last, not just from the weight, but from what it all meant. Thomas didn't cry. Not exactly, but his throat tightened with every stride. His heart beat louder than the thunder. Walls he'd built after Lily's death, walls of silence, of solitude, of fear, began to fall. Shadow didn't whine. He just let himself be held, and Thomas held him like something precious. The fire crackled. Again this time, with company, Shadow lay on a blanket near the hearth, leg wrapped gently in an old towel. His sides rose and fell in slow rhythm, peaceful for the first time. Thomas sat nearby, sipping hot tea, watching the flames and the dog. He didn't speak, didn't need to, because in the stillness of that small cabin, the silence no longer felt empty. Two hearts had found a rhythm. Two lives, once broken, now healing, together. The town had always known Shadow as the stray dog that appeared from nowhere, hanging around the cemetery, his eyes always filled with a quiet sadness. No one knew his true story until now. Thomas stood frozen in the old woman's living room. His heart pounded in his chest as she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. The small cottage smelled of lavender and old wood, the air heavy with something unsaid. With eyes that seemed to carry years of sorrow, she looked up at Thomas, her voice breaking the silence. "That's Duke," she whispered, her breath hitching. He was Emily's. Thomas blinked, confusion clouding his mind. Emily. Her eyes welled up with tears, the weight of years pressing down on her frail shoulders. Emily was a little girl. She was sick. Duke was her therapy dog. They were inseparable. He stayed with her every day at the hospital, in the darkest hours. He never left her side. The revelation hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. The dog he'd grown to love, the one who'd brought light back into his world, had once been someone else's lifeliner, little girl's companion in her final days. The old woman continued, her voice soft, but full of a profound ache. Emily wasn't like the other kids. She was fragile, always in pain. But Duke, he gave her comfort. He was her lifeline. He would lie next to her, his head on her lap, soothing her when the world became too much. He never left, not once. Thomas's throat tightened. He tried to imagine the bond they'd shared, the depth of their connection. Shadow, who had now become his own lifeline in this quiet town, had once been the one to anchor Emily through her storms. She passed away, the old woman murmured, and Duke didn't know how to live without her. Thomas sat quietly, digesting the weight of the woman's words. His fingers clenched around the cup of tea she had offered him, the steam rising in slow spirals. After Emily's funeral, Duke disappeared. The woman continued. A week later, I saw him standing at the foot of her grave, his head lowered, as if he were waiting for her to come back. Thomas's heart ached at the image of the dog, alone in the world. But now, as he looked at the dog before him, Shadow, he understood. The loyalty that had once been for Emily, the devotion he had shown in life, had never faltered. It had just found another place to call home. He was searching for her. The old woman whispered, her eyes far away in the past. Now I know. He went to her grave. The peace of the cemetery was soon shattered by the distant sound of a truck engine. Thomas's heart sank as the flashing lights of an animal control vehicle rolled into the gravel lot. "We have a report of a stray," the officer called out as he stepped from the truck, his eyes scanning the area. "Might be dangerous." The officer's eyes locked on Shadow, who lay near the edge of the cemetery, his gaze steady. but something deep inside him stirred a tension he couldn't shake. The officer's hand hovered near his radio, ready to call for backup. "He's not dangerous," Thomas said quickly, stepping forward. "He's just ... grieving." But the officer's gaze was cold, dismissive. "A dog that's been wandering this long can't be trusted. We're taking him in for now." Shadow's ears flattened as he instinctively backed away, his eyes not leaving Thomas. The fear was palpable in the air, fear of losing the only family he had left. Panic swept over Thomas as he moved to block the officer's path. "You can't take him," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "He's all I have left." The officer glanced at him with a raised eyebrow, his expression hard. "You're not his owner. I'm his family," Thomas said, his voice firm with conviction. "You don't understand what this dog has been through. You can't just take him away." His plea hung in the air, thick with emotion. He couldn't lose Shadow. Not after everything they'd been through together. Not after the way Shadow had helped him heal, the way he'd brought life back into his lonely, broken existence. The tension grew as the officer stepped back, radioing for backup. "We'll take him to the pound. The town can decide what happens next." The officer's words were final. Thomas's heart sank further, but there was nothing he could do to change the situation, not right now. They would have to hold a hearing, and the fate of his loyal companion would lie in the hands of the people who had always viewed him as nothing more than a stray dot at the town hall meeting. Thomas stood before a crowd of people, some who had never spoken to him before, others who had only seen him in passing, none of whom knew the true depth of the bond between him and Shadow. He stayed with her until the end. Thomas began, his voice quivering, "And he stayed here ever since. Shadow is not just a dog. He's a friend, a companion, a part of my life." The crowd was quiet, some nodding, others unsure. But Thomas could feel the weight of their judgments. Some still saw Shadow as a threat, a dangerous animal that needed to be contained. But Thomas knew the truth. Shadow was more than just a dog. He was a symbol of unwavering loyalty, of love that never fades. As the debate raged on, the townspeople's voices grew louder. Some spoke passionately in Shadow's defense, calling him a hero in disguise, dog who had stayed loyal to a sick little girl, and now to Thomas. Others, however, called him a risky, unpredictable stray who posed a danger to the community. Tension hung heavy in the air, and Thomas's heart raced. He knew the truth, but would they see it? Would they understand the bond they shared? Just as the argument reached its peak, a voice rang out over the crowd. "A child is missing near the woods by the cemetery." Gasps echoed through the room as people scrambled to their feet. The room was in chaos, but Thomas didn't hesitate. He turned to look at Shadow, who was sitting near the door, his eyes alert. Without a word, Shadow bolted, racing out the door and toward the woods, acting on instinct. Shadow tore through the cemetery gates, his paws pounding against the earth. He wasn't running away, he was running toward something, something only. He understood. Hours passed, and the sound of Shadow's barking echoed through the trees. Then a distant cry pierced the air. A little boy, trapped beneath the heavy branches of a fallen tree. Thomas's heart raced as he ran into the woods, following Shadow's desperate barks. They found the boy, his face streaked with tears, his leg pinned beneath the debris. The rescue team arrived just in time, but it was Shadow who had saved the boy's life. He had led them to the spot, guiding them through the woods with unwavering determination. Shadow's story had changed in an instant from a ghost dog, wandering aimlessly, to a hero in the eyes of the town. The very people who once doubted him now celebrated his loyalty, his courage, his unwavering love. Thomas stood beside him, his heart full as the townspeople rallied around Shadow, a hero in every sense of the word. Together, they had proven that love, loyalty, and sacrifice could heal even the deepest wounds. The courtroom was silent, save for the slow, deliberate sound of the judge's gavel. Thomas stood, eyes locked on the small wooden bench where the official papers were signed, his heart hammered in his chest, a mixture of fear, excitement, and anticipation building within him. As the judge read aloud the final words, Thomas felt the weight of a decision that was more than just legal, it was emotional. "I hereby declare this adoption official," the judge pronounced, looking down at the German shepherd who sat calmly at Thomas' side. Shadow was no longer a stray, no longer a lost soul. He was Duke Shadow now, his name forever tied to the woman he had lost, a living legacy of Emily's love. The days following the adoption were full of change. Thomas' home, once a place of solitude and sorrow, slowly began to feel full again. No longer did the quiet corners echo with grief. There was Duke, padding across the floors, his tail wagging in unison with Thomas' steady heartbeat. Every room now had a warmth. Every corner seemed to pulse with life, as if the house itself was learning to heal. Duke was more than a companion. He was the missing piece, the second chance Thomas had needed. And in return, he gave Duke a new life, a home that was now theirs together. Inspired by the bond he had forged with Duke, Thomas began to visit the local animal shelter regularly. At first, it was just a way to fill the time, a means to honor the spirit of giving that Duke had reawakened in him. But soon, it became something more. Thomas found himself pulling his coat tight against the cold as he opened the gates, each visit rekindling the spark of compassion within him. He didn't just see the abandoned animals anymore, he saw stories. He saw lives waiting for a second chance, just like Duke had been. Volunteering felt right, as if, in caring for others, he was healing his own heart. In the months that followed, Thomas began to slowly re-enter the world. He started speaking to neighbors, offering smiles where once he had only offered silence. With Duke always by his side, Thomas found himself shedding the heavy cloak of isolation that had wrapped itself around him since Emily's death. They walked through the park, greeted familiar faces, and even attended town events. It was as though, little by little, Thomas was being drawn out of the shadows, and with Duke's loyal presence, the world didn't feel so impossible to rejoin. On what would have been Emily's birthday, Thomas took Duke to the cemetery. The air was cold, the ground frozen underfoot, but there was a quiet, peaceful serenity that had settled over the hill where Emily rested. They approached her grave, and Thomas kneeled, his fingers trembling as he placed the wildflowers gently on the stone. Duke stood beside him, head tilted, as if sensing the significance of the moment. There, in the stillness of the snow, a new tradition began, one born of love, loss, and healing. They didn't speak, but their quiet connection said everything. The years passed, and the simple act of honoring Emily's memory each year at the cemetery grew into something more. Word had spread throughout the town, touched by the story of Thomas and Duke's journey. What had started as a quiet ritual between a grieving man and his dog became an annual tradition. Each year, townspeople, moved by the love between Thomas and Duke, joined them at the cemetery. Together, they left flowers in the snow, a collective remembrance of the past, and a celebration of the second chances that both man and dog had found. One autumn evening, as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, Thomas and Duke stood at the top of the hill, watching the light dance across the cemetery. The air was crisp, the leaves crunching beneath their feet, but there was a stillness, a quiet calm that settled over Thomas' heart. He had come a long way since the day Duke had entered his life, through grief, through loss, and through healing. Now, as he stood with Duke by his side, he finally felt the weight of the past lift. He could remember Emily without pain, without regret. With Duke's comforting presence, Thomas found the peace he had longed for, a sense of closure that had eluded him for so long. As the evening wore on and the last of the sun's rays slipped behind the horizon, Thomas sat on the cemetery's stone bench, Duke lying beside him. The wind gently carried the leaves across the graveyard, scattering them like confetti. It was a moment that could have been filled with sorrow, but for Thomas, it was something else entirely. He smiled, not because he had forgotten the pain, but because he had learned to live with it. The sorrow had softened into something gentler, a quiet contentment that only time and healing could bring. Duke lifted his head, watching the leaves swirl by, his eyes full of the same calm understanding that Thomas now carried in his heart. They didn't need words to communicate. Together they had found peace, and in that peace they found joy. Thomas sat by the fireplace, the soft glow of the flames casting a warm light across the room. His gaze drifted to Duke, now sleeping peacefully at his feet. The dog's steady breathing was the only sound in the quiet house. Thomas couldn't help but reflect on the years of silence, of emptiness. He had lost Emily, the love of his life, so suddenly that the hole in his chest never seemed to close. But Duke had come to him at a time when he thought nothing could fill the void. The dog didn't just provide company. He became the bridge between the broken man he was and the man he could be again. Slowly, patiently, Duke had taught him to breathe again. He hadn't healed the wound, but he had made it easier to bear, showing Thomas that even the deepest pain could soften with time and love. Thomas leaned back in his chair, watching Duke as the dog nuzzled into the blanket on the couch. No words were needed. Duke had never asked for much, just a pat, a meal, a few moments of attention. But in those small, quiet gestures, a bond had formed stronger than words could ever express. Loyalty wasn't loud. It didn't demand recognition. It simply was. Thomas had learned, in his own way, that sometimes love spoke in the silence of shared moments. Duke's quiet presence had shown him that love, in its purest form, didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Grief had done its damage. It had created walls in Thomas's heart, thick and unyielding. He had avoided people, closed himself off from the world. But Duke didn't care about walls. Every morning, the dog would nudge at his leg, an invitation to come outside, to step back into the world. Slowly, Duke's persistence began to tear down the barriers Thomas had built. It wasn't therapy or advice that had begun the healing. Process it was a dog's gentle nudge, asking for nothing but a little companionship. Duke had been the first to show Thomas that grief could be met not with resistance, but with understanding. The walls had come down, bit by bit, with Duke. Leading the way, the townspeople had often told Thomas how lucky Duke was to have found him. "You gave him a chance," they would say. But in Thomas's heart, he knew the truth. Duke had given him a chance. The dog had been the one to pull him from the darkness of his grief. He hadn't just rescued Duke. Duke had rescued him in ways he couldn't even put into words. Thomas had needed the dog as much as Duke had needed him, maybe more. As he looked into Duke's eyes, full of unconditional love, he realized that sometimes the rescuer and the rescued were one and the same. Duke had been astray, forgotten and lost. But Thomas, like so many others, had seen something in him. He had given him a second chance, not just as a dog, but as a companion, a friend. It was easy to believe that second chances were only for those who had been broken, for animals with no home, no family. But in truth, second chances weren't just for strays. They were for anyone willing to believe in the possibility of healing, for anyone brave enough to open their hearts again. Thomas realized that it wasn't just Duke who had been given a new life, he had been given one too. The cemetery hill had become a place of quiet reflection for Thomas, but today it felt different. With Duke by his side, Thomas didn't feel the same weight of loss he had once felt. He had come to the hill to remember Emily, but it was no longer just about the past. Today, the hill felt like a place of life's not death. Thomas had transformed, no longer frozen in the past, but living fully, with hope and with Duke by his side. He had become more than a man grieving his wife. He had become someone who had learned to love again, to embrace the second chance that life, with Duke, had offered him. Thomas smiled, looking down at Duke, who wagged his tail in response. The world was a little brighter now, a little more forgiving. Together, they had learned that healing came in many forms, sometimes in the gentle touch of a dog, in the quiet companionship of a loyal friend. Through Duke, Thomas had rediscovered the beauty of second chances, of healing, of love. The bond they shared was more than just man and dog. It was a testament to the resilience of the heart, the quiet power of unconditional love, and the endless possibility of new beginnings.